"Sign it, Dad, or get out tonight." My son screamed as he took my house keys. I signed quietly with tears in my eyes, but when he read the one clause at the end, his smile disappeared. "Sign it, Dad, or get out tonight." Neil's voice filled the kitchen like something that had been building pressure behind a valve for months, and had finally found the crack. He had my house keys in his hand, my actual keys, off the hook by the back door where they'd hung for 40 years, and he was holding them the way you hold something you've already decided belongs to you. I didn't answer right away. I've never been a man who answers right away. And at 71, with a title that's been sitting in my name since before Neil could walk, I wasn't about to start now. Not even with my own son standing in my kitchen at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, looking like a stranger wearing my boy's face. Vanessa stood a step behind him, arms crossed, saying nothing, which was somehow worse than if she'd been shouting too. She'd learned, I think, that silence from her did more work in that kitchen than any words of hers ever could. On the table between us sat a manila folder, and inside it, 3 pages stapled together, and on top of those 3 pages, a pen. Not my pen, his. A cheap plastic one from the credit union, the kind they leave in a cup by the drive-through window. I picked the folder up. My hands weren't shaking, which surprised even me a little, because everything else in that kitchen was shaking. Neil's voice. The light over the stove that had needed a new ballast for 2 years. Something in my own chest that I couldn't name and didn't try to. I read the first page. Ordinary enough. Names, an address I'd known my whole life. Boilerplate language about consideration and grantors and grantees that I understood better than my son probably assumed I did. Then I got to a line near the very bottom of the last page. A single sentence tucked in among paragraphs Neil had clearly never read past the first 2 lines of. And I felt something in my chest go quiet and still, the way a room goes quiet right before somebody says something that changes everything in it. I looked up at my son. I looked at the pen, and I picked it up. "Okay, Neil," I said. "I'll sign." He didn't smile yet. He was too busy watching my hand to smile. But Vanessa did, just slightly, just at the corner of her mouth, the particular smile of a woman who has spent 2 years waiting for exactly this moment. I signed my name on the line at the bottom, the way I've signed my name 10,000 times in 71 years. Timber contracts, my wife's hospital consent forms, Neil's own report cards back when a father's signature still meant something in that house. Then I set the pen down, and I looked at my son, and I said the only thing I had left to say that night. "You should read the whole thing before you file it." He didn't hear me. He was already reaching for the folder, already grinning at Vanessa, already halfway to being a man who owned a house he had never once, in 38 years of living in this town, bothered to understand. The house sits on 11 acres outside Cedar Hollow, Vermont, at the end of a gravel road that the town stopped grading regularly sometime in the 90s, which has always suited me fine, because a road that's slightly inconvenient tends to keep out people who don't actually want to be there. My father, Elias Bramwell, built the core of it himself in 1951, the year before I was born, working most weekends and every evening after his shift at the granite works. He wasn't a builder by trade. He was a stone cutter, and it shows in the house if you know where to look. The fireplace mantel he carved from a single piece of Vermont granite too heavy for 2 men to lift. The front steps that have outlasted 3 separate porches built onto the house around them because nobody, including me, has ever had the heart to touch that particular piece of stone. I grew up in that house. I brought Vivian to it the first time in 1974, 3 months before we married, and she stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Neil would stand 49 years later holding my keys like a threat. And she told me it smelled like wood smoke, and something she couldn't place, something that turned out. She told me years afterward to be the particular mineral smell of my father's granite dust, worked so deep into the floorboards over decades that no amount of cleaning ever fully lifted it out. We raised Neil and Lorraine in that house. I added the second bathroom myself in 1986, the year Lorraine turned 8, and made it clear, in the specific, unambiguous way 8-year-old girls make things clear, that sharing one bathroom with her brother was no longer an arrangement she intended to tolerate. I built the workshop out back in 1991. So I'd have somewhere to go that smelled like sawdust, instead of whatever was happening in the house that particular decade, which is a joke, mostly, though not entirely. Vivian died in that house too, in the front bedroom, in March of 2019, 4 years before the night Neil stood in my kitchen with my own keys in his fist. ovarian cancer, caught late, the way it too often is. I nursed her the last 4 months myself, with help from a hospice nurse who came 3 times a week and who told me near the very end that she'd rarely seen a marriage hold its shape as steadily under that kind of weight as ours did. I want you to understand what that house actually is before I tell you what my son tried to do to it, because a stranger looking at 11 acres and a granite mantle sees real estate. I look at that same mantle and see my father's hands. I look at the kitchen and see my wife standing in it 50 years running. And I look at the bathroom I built in 3 exhausting weekends in 1986, and I see a father who was, whatever else he got wrong later, trying. I haven't yet told you about Neil and Vanessa's own children, and I want to correct that here, because they matter enormously to everything that happened, even though they were far too young to understand any of it at the time. They have 2, Caleb, who's 10 now, and Molly, who's 7, both of them regular visitors to this house for their whole lives. Caleb has spent hours in my workshop over the years, careful and curious in a way that reminds me, more than I usually let myself admit, of my own father at that age. Molly has a particular fondness for the granite mantle in the front room, runs her small hand along the carved edge of it every single visit, the same way I remember doing myself as a boy, though I've never told her that, wanting to let her own fascination with it be entirely her own. The house is not an asset to me. It has never once, in 71 years, been an asset to me. It is the last room in the world where I can still hear both of my parents' voices and my wife's voice, all at the same time, in the ordinary creak of a floorboard nobody has ever bothered to fix. To Neil, by the year this all came to a head, it had become something else entirely. A number. 11 acres and 4 bedrooms in a county where land prices had roughly tripled since the pandemic. A number he'd started saying out loud at family dinners the way other men might mention the weather. I want to tell you more about Vivian, because I've mentioned her mostly in the context of her death so far, and that isn't fair to the 50 years she actually lived. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 2 buildings down from mine, which meant we drove into town together most mornings for 31 years, a small daily ritual neither of us ever tired of. Even on the mornings, we had nothing particular to say to each other. She had a laugh that carried, genuinely carried, the kind of laugh that made people 2 rooms away smile without knowing why, and she used it liberally, on good days, and more impressively, on hard ones too. She was the one who insisted we take Neil and Lorraine camping every summer. Even the summer's money was tight, because she said children needed to remember their parents doing something other than working and worrying. I still have a photograph from 1998, faded now, of the 4 of us at a campsite on Lake Willoughby. Neil, maybe 7 years old, missing his front teeth, grinning at a fish he'd caught that was, if I'm being generous, roughly the size of my thumb. Vivian kept that photograph on the refrigerator for years, moved it to a frame in the hallway eventually, and it's still there now, the only photograph in this house Neil has never once in all the years since his mother died asked me to take down or pack away. She was better than I was, I'll admit plainly, at seeing people clearly. She saw something in Vanessa within the first year of Neil bringing her around that I didn't fully see myself for another decade. Not malice, she was careful to say. Never malice. But a kind of fear dressed up as ambition. A woman who'd grown up with genuine financial instability in her own family and had decided somewhere along the way that she would never again be the person in a room without a plan for security. Vivian liked her. I want to be clear about that. She simply understood her more completely than I did. And she told me once, a few years before she got sick, "Keep an eye on that girl's fear, Harold. Fear makes people do things pride alone never would." I didn't fully understand what she meant until years after she was gone. Sitting in a kitchen watching that same fear, dressed up in a folder and a rehearsed ultimatum, finally show its whole shape. I should tell you what I did with my working life, because it matters to understanding the kind of man who sat calmly in that kitchen reading a deed instead of shouting back at his own son. I taught high school chemistry and physics at Cedar Hollow Regional for 31 years, from 1975 until I retired in 2006. It wasn't a career I set out to have. I'd studied engineering for 2 years at the State University before deciding I preferred explaining how things worked to actually building them for a living, a distinction that used to make my father laugh. A stonecutter's son choosing chalk dust over granite dust. 31 years teaching teenagers does something specific to a man's temperament, something I don't think people outside the profession fully appreciate. You learn fairly quickly that shouting rarely changes anyone's mind, that the students who respond best to a raised voice are usually the ones who've simply learned to perform contrition until the moment passes, and that the actual work of changing somebody's thinking happens slowly, through patience, through asking the right question at the right moment, and then having the discipline to wait for an honest answer instead of filling the silence yourself. I taught roughly 3,100 students across those 3 decades, by my own rough count, and a fair number of them still recognize me at the grocery store in town. Grown men and women now with children and grandchildren of their own, and more than a few of them have told me, over the years, some version of the same thing, that they didn't remember much specific chemistry, but they remembered that Mr. Bramwell never once raised his voice. Not in 3 decades. Not even the year a junior named Todd Aldis set his own lab table on fire attempting an unauthorized experiment involving a Bunsen burner and a can of hairspray he'd smuggled in. I mention all this because I think it explains something about the night Neil screamed at me over those keys. I've spent my entire adult life in rooms where the loudest person was very rarely the one who actually understood what was happening. I learned that lesson at 26 years old, standing in front of 30 ninth graders who could smell fear and uncertainty the way sharks smell blood in the water, and I never once forgot it. Neil wasn't always like this. I want to say that clearly at the start because it would be easy to tell the story as though my son arrived in this world already grasping, and that isn't true, and it isn't fair to him. He was a generous boy. Genuinely. At 9 years old, he gave his own bicycle to a kid down the road whose family couldn't afford one, and when I asked him about it, mildly concerned, he told me he still had 2 legs and Danny Ferris didn't have any bike at all, so the math seemed obvious to him. I've never forgotten that sentence. I think about it more now than I did for 30 years in between. There's another memory I want to give you, from when Neil was 12, because I think it shows something about who he actually was before circumstance and fear started working on him. A friend of his, a boy named Petey Voss, whose father had recently lost his job at the Granite Works, got caught shoplifting a candy bar from the general store in town. Small thing, in the scheme of things. But the store owner, a hard, unforgiving man named Curtis Denby, was threatening to call the police over a $1.50 candy bar, mostly, I think, to make an example of a family already struggling. Neil walked the 4 miles into town by himself, without telling Vivian or me, and offered to work off the debt himself, sweeping the store, stocking shelves, whatever Curtis needed done, if he'd let Petey go without calling anyone. He was 12 years old. Curtis called me that evening, half annoyed, half genuinely moved, and told me my son had shown up at his store looking like he meant business, and that he'd ended up giving both boys jobs sweeping up on Saturdays that whole summer, out of what I think was mostly astonishment that a 12-year-old had thought to try. That's the boy I raised. That's who Neil actually was, underneath everything that came later, and I want that fact sitting next to everything I'm about to tell you about the years his fear got louder than his better instincts, because I don't think a story is honest if it only shows you one version of a person. I want to tell you about a specific memory of my own father, from when I was 28 years old, because I think it belongs here, even though I didn't understand its full weight until decades later. It was 1980, 6 years before Elias updated his will, and I'd come to him with what I thought at the time was a reasonable request, a loan, $4,000, to help cover a shortfall in the school district's budget the year they were threatening layoffs. And I was trying to protect my own position by, absurdly, offering to personally cover a gap in supply costs for my classroom, rather than risk being seen as expendable. It was a foolish plan, born of a young teacher's anxiety more than good sense, and my father, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table Neil would later scream at me across, said no. Not a soft no. A clear one. Harold, that isn't your debt to pay, and this is a bad idea born of fear, not of good judgment. I love you, and the answer is no. I was furious with him for nearly a month. I thought he was being cheap, or worse, that he didn't trust my judgment as a grown man capable of managing his own career. It took me years, genuinely years, to understand that my father's no that day had actually protected me from a decision I'd have regretted for a decade. A decision my own fear was pushing me toward the same way fear pushed Neil toward that folder on my kitchen counter, 43 years later. I think about that no often now. I think my father taught me, without either of us fully realizing it at the time, exactly what it looks like to love someone enough to disappoint them in the short term for their own longer good. I didn't consciously model my own handling of Neil's ultimatum after that memory. But I don't think it's coincidence either that the son of a man who once told me no with total clarity and total love turned out to be capable of doing something similar himself, decades later, in the same kitchen, over a considerably larger stake. He studied business at the State University, came home most holidays, married Vanessa Whitcomb in 2009, in a ceremony in this very backyard, under a tent Vivian and I paid for without being asked. Because that's simply what you do for your children, when you can. I liked Vanessa well enough at first. She was sharp, ambitious, the kind of young woman who had a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan, and probably a plan for what she'd do if the first 2 plans failed. I didn't hold that against her. I've never trusted a person who doesn't plan for anything. Neil started a landscaping and small excavation company in 2011, Bramwell Grounds and Grading, and for the first 6 or 7 years it did well enough. He hired 2 men, then 4, then bought a second truck, then a third. Vivian was so proud of him she kept a folder of his invoices. Actual invoices. Just to look through some evenings, the way other grandmothers keep photographs. The trouble started, as trouble in a small business usually does, without anybody noticing the exact day it started. Neil took on a large contract in 2019, grading and drainage work for a new development outside Rutland, and financed a second excavator and a new dump truck against the promise of that contract's revenue. The development stalled. Zoning delays. A lawsuit between 2 of the investors that had nothing to do with Neil at all. 18 months of a half-graded lot sitting there earning nobody $1, while my son's equipment payments came due every single month regardless. That was 2019, the same year Vivian got sick. I want you to sit with that timing for a moment, because I've had to sit with it myself for years now. My son's business started to genuinely struggle in the exact same season his mother was dying. And I don't know this, but I think that the fear those 2 things together put into a man in his early 30s did something to him that a business failure alone might not have. He didn't ask me for help that year. I offered twice, and he refused both times, proud in the particular way a young man is proud right up until pride stops being affordable. I respected that. At the time. I understand now that it might have been the year the first door quietly opened, the year he started doing arithmetic about a house he'd grown up believing, in some vague, unexamined way, would eventually be his. I want to give you a fuller picture of exactly what Neil's business situation looked like by that final summer. Because financial trouble can mean almost anything, and I think the specifics matter to understanding how genuinely frightened my son actually was, whatever his methods. Bramwell Grounds and Grading owed, at its peak difficulty, just over $140,000 across 2 equipment loans, and a line of credit he'd drawn down covering payroll during the 18-month stall on that Rutland development contract. His largest remaining client, a property management company that handled seasonal grounds work for 6 condominium developments around the lake, had started sending payments net 90% instead of the net 30% they'd originally agreed to. A slow squeeze that meant Neil was often paying his own crew and his own equipment notes out of savings while waiting months for money he'd already legitimately earned. He'd taken out a second mortgage on his and Vanessa's own house and bar the year before, a decision Vanessa had pushed for and Neil had gone along with, hoping it would bridge the gap until the Rutland contract finally resumed. It hadn't been enough. By that final summer, he was, by his own later admission, somewhere around 6 weeks from a genuine business-ending cash crisis, the kind that doesn't just cost you a company, but potentially costs you your own home too, since the second mortgage meant Vanessa and Neil's own house was now directly exposed to the business's failure in a way it hadn't been before. I want to be clear that none of this excuses what he did in my kitchen, but I think it's important, telling this story honestly, to show you that Neil wasn't chasing an unnecessary luxury or a vague sense of entitlement in the abstract. He was, by any reasonable measure, genuinely terrified of losing everything he'd built, watching a second mortgage threaten a home with his own 2 young children in it. And fear, as my late wife told me more than once, makes people reach for solutions pride alone would never permit. The first real betrayal, the first thing I couldn't explain away as simply a hard year, happened in the spring of 2021. I came home from a doctor's appointment in Rutland to find a car in my driveway I didn't recognize, and a woman I'd never met standing on my front porch with a clipboard, taking photographs of the house from 3 different angles. "Can I help you?" I asked her. "Oh, hi. I'm Carrie with Green Mountain Realty. Neil asked me to come out and get some preliminary photos just for our files. He said you knew I was coming." I did not know she was coming. I stood in my own driveway and understood, with a kind of cold, specific clarity, that my son had invited a real estate agent onto my property to photograph my house for sale purposes, and had either forgotten to tell me, or, and this was the possibility that actually kept me up that night, had decided he didn't need to. I called him that evening. He was apologetic, in the fast, over-smooth way people are apologetic when they're more sorry about getting caught than about the thing itself. He said Vanessa had suggested it, just to understand our options, just so they'd have information. Nothing binding, nothing serious, Dad. Don't make a whole thing out of it. I let it go. That was my mistake, if I made one. Not the anger, but the letting go of it. Because I told myself a man is allowed to make one mistake with his son's feelings before it counts against him for anything. I have a friend named Gordon Wheelock, retired from the granite works, same as my father before him, though a full generation later, and we've known each other since we were boys ourselves. Back when Cedar Hollow had 2 working quarries, instead of the one that survives today, mostly as a tourist curiosity. Gordon lives about a mile down the road, close enough that he noticed, the way small-town neighbors notice things, when Carrie the realtor's car started appearing in my driveway with some regularity that spring. He didn't say anything for a while. That's Gordon's way. He lets a thing sit until he's certain it's actually his business to mention, which took him about 4 months. Until one Saturday morning he showed up at my door with 2 coffees from the diner in town and sat down on my porch steps without being invited to. Exactly the way I'd have done at his house. "Harold," he said, "I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed the real estate woman's car out here more than once. It's nothing serious, Gordon. I've known you 63 years. You get a particular look when something's not nothing." He drank his coffee for a minute, looking out at the yard. "I'm not going to tell you what to do about your own family. Lord knows I've made enough mistakes with my own kids that I've got no business handing out advice. But I want you to know I'm right down the road. And if you ever need somewhere to sit for an evening that isn't this house, my door's open, day or night. And I won't ask a single question you don't want to answer." I took him up on that offer more than once over the following 2 years, sitting on his own porch some evenings saying very little. And Gordon, true to his word, asked me nothing at all most nights. Just refilled my coffee and let the quiet do whatever work it needed to do. There's a particular kind of friendship I've come to understand built entirely out of 60 years of small kindnesses and almost no actual conversation. And I don't know that I properly appreciated what Gordon Wheelock was to me until the years I genuinely needed exactly what he'd always quietly offered. 3 months later, at a Sunday dinner, Neil brought up the house directly for the first time. Not as a hypothetical, as a plan. "Dad, hear me out," he said, setting down his fork with the particular deliberateness of a man who's rehearsed an opening line. "You're rattling around out here alone on 11 acres. The taxes alone must be brutal. What if we talked about you moving into something smaller in town, and we handled the sale of this place together, as a family? This is my home, Neil. I know it is. But Mom's gone, and it's a lot of house for one person, and honestly, with what land's going for right now, this could set all of us up. You, me, Lorraine, the kids' college funds. I'm not saying tomorrow. I'm just saying think about it." I looked at my son across that table. In the dining room, his own grandfather had added a bay window to in 1968. And I understood that the word "all of us" in his sentence did not actually include his sister. Not really, not in the way the sentence pretended it did. Lorraine wasn't at that dinner. Lorraine was almost never invited to those conversations anymore, and I'd started to notice that pattern without yet understanding what it meant. "I'll think about it," I told him, which was a lie, and we both knew it was a lie, and neither of us said so out loud. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It arrived the way water arrives in a basement, with a hairline crack in the foundation, slowly, then suddenly, then everywhere. By the fall of 2022, Vanessa had started coming to nearly every visit, or before she'd come to maybe half of them. And she had opinions now about things that had never previously been her business. The cost of heating a house that size, whether I was managing my own medications properly, whether it was really safe for a man my age to be driving that gravel road alone in winter. I want to try to be fair to Vanessa here, because I think a story like this one is more honest and more useful to anyone listening to it, if it doesn't simply flatten a difficult person into a villain. Vanessa grew up outside Bennington, the oldest of 4 children, in a household where money genuinely was not there most months. Her father worked seasonal construction, her mother cleaned houses, and Vanessa has told me more than once, in calmer years before all of this, about being 12 years old and answering the phone to collections agencies so her mother wouldn't have to hear their voices. She put herself through community college working nights at a diner, transferred to the state university on scholarships and loans, and met Neil in an economics class neither of them particularly enjoyed. I think that childhood built something real and understandable in her, a genuine, bone-deep fear of financial instability that never fully left, no matter how comfortable her own adult life eventually became. I don't think Vanessa woke up one morning and decided to manipulate an old man out of his house for sport. I think she looked at a struggling business, 2 young children, and a father-in-law sitting on 11 valuable acres, and genuinely convinced herself, the way frightened people often do, that the compassionate thing, the responsible thing, was to make sure that asset got converted into security for her own family before it was too late. That doesn't excuse what happened in my kitchen that Tuesday night. I want to be clear about that. Understanding where a person's fear comes from is not the same as excusing what that fear pushes them to do to someone else. But I've found, in the months since, that holding both of those things at once, genuine sympathy for the woman she is, and genuine refusal to reward what she pushed my son to do, has been more honest, and ultimately more peaceful, than choosing to see her as simply cruel. "We just worry Harold," she told me once, using my first name the way she always did, a habit I'd never quite gotten used to from a daughter-in-law. "Neil worries himself sick some nights." I didn't see much evidence of that sickness. What I saw was a son who had started bringing a folder of his own to dinners, printouts of comparable home sales in the county. A rough sketch once of what a mother-in-law suite conversion of my garage might look like, drawn by an architect Neil had apparently already consulted without mentioning it to me. The criticism came next, dressed up as concern the way it always is. My lawn wasn't being mowed to Neil's satisfaction, though I'd hired the same 17-year-old from down the road to do it for 3 summers running, same as I always had. My grocery habits came under review. Too much red meat, not enough of whatever Vanessa had recently read about online. Once, memorably, Neil suggested, gently but unmistakably, that I should consider giving up the workshop, since, at your age, Dad, all that dust can't be good for your lungs. A workshop I'd been standing in 3 or 4 evenings a week for 32 years without incident. I should be honest about my own body during all of this too, because a 71-year-old man doesn't get to have a story like this one without his own physical decline playing some quiet part in the background of it. My knees have gotten worse over these past years, arthritis mostly, the ordinary kind that comes with 7 decades of use rather than any dramatic injury. I use a cane on bad mornings now, something I resisted for longer than was probably wise, out of a vanity I'm not particularly proud of. My hearing has thinned enough that I've finally agreed to hearing aids, small devices I still catch myself forgetting to put in some mornings. 40 years of a classroom voice apparently having convinced some stubborn part of me that I don't actually need help hearing anyone. I mention this because I think it matters to understanding exactly what Neil was gambling on that Tuesday night, whether he fully realized it or not. He was betting, at some level, on an old man's fear of his own decline, the fear that a house too big to maintain, a body too worn to keep up with it, a mind that might, someday, not be trusted with its own decisions, would make me desperate enough to sign anything that promised to simplify my life. I understand that fear. I feel it myself. Some mornings, standing in a kitchen too large for one person, knees complaining about the walk to the mailbox and back. What Neil didn't account for is that fear about the future and clarity about the present aren't the same thing. I am genuinely afraid some days of what my own body has coming for me. I was not, that Tuesday night, confused about what I was reading on that page, however tired the rest of me may have felt. None of these things, on their own, were unreasonable. That's what made them work. A son is allowed to worry about his father's lawn. A daughter-in-law is allowed to have opinions about diet. It was the accumulation that told the real story, the way each individual comment functioned less like concern and more like a slow campaign to convince me, and everyone else in the family, that I was becoming a man who could no longer be trusted with his own decisions. There was another incident in the summer of 2023 that earns its own mention here. I came home from a Tuesday morning at the senior center in town. I'd started volunteering there twice a week, teaching a small informal class on basic home chemistry safety. Of all things, mostly for the company more than any real sense of purpose, to find a contractor's truck in my driveway and two men measuring my garage with a laser level. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The older of the two straightened up, apologetic. "Sorry, sir. We were told this was cleared with the homeowner. Neil Bramwell. He wants an estimate on converting this garage into an accessory dwelling unit. Said it'd be good rental income, or a place for an in-law suite down the line." I stood in my own driveway, watching strangers assess a piece of my property for a purpose I had never once approved. And I understood, more clearly than I had at any point before that morning, exactly how far my son had already traveled down a road he hadn't yet told me he was walking. I called Neil that afternoon. He was less apologetic this time than he'd been about the realtor, almost defensive, in a way that told me something about how much less he cared by then, about whether I'd noticed or minded. "I was just getting information, Dad. It's not like I did anything. I can't even do anything. It's your house." "Then why did you tell the contractor it was cleared?" There was a pause on the line, the specific pause of a man realizing he said more than he meant to. "I probably should have called you first. I'm sorry." He said sorry. "I want you to notice that, because it would happen again, that particular word, cheap and quick and easy, several more times over the following year, each time landing a little less than the time before it. The way any word does, when it's spent without ever once being backed up by a changed behavior. I want to say a little more about that senior center class, because it became more important to those 2 difficult years than I initially let on. I'd started it in early 2022, mostly out of restlessness. Vivian had been gone 3 years by then, in retirement, which had felt spacious and welcome in my first years away from teaching, had started to feel, some weeks, uncomfortably quiet. A friend from church mentioned the center was looking for volunteers to run any kind of regular class, and I thought, half joking at the time, that 31 years teaching teenagers to safely handle chemicals in a lab probably qualified me to teach a room full of 70 and 80-year-olds not to mix bleach and ammonia under their own kitchen sinks. The class itself was small, usually 8 to 12 people, mostly widows and widowers who'd outlived spouses who used to handle that particular category of household knowledge. But something about that room, twice a week, gave me a version of purpose that the rest of my life, during those 2 pressured years, wasn't consistently providing. I was, in that room, simply Mr. Bramwell again, a man whose knowledge was wanted, rather than a man whose competence was being quietly, persistently questioned by his own family. I think that room mattered more than I realized at the time to how calmly I was eventually able to sit in my own kitchen and read a document without panicking. A man who spends 2 mornings a week reminding himself he's still capable, still useful, still trusted by a room full of people who value what he knows, carries a different kind of confidence into a confrontation than a man who's spent those same 2 years being told in 100 small ways that he can no longer be trusted with his own decisions. I still teach that class. 11 students now, up from the original 8. And I'd like to think at least a few of them are there for reasons that have very little to do with bleach and ammonia, and a great deal to do with simply having somewhere to be that reminds them who they still are. I should tell you more about Lorraine, because so far she's mostly appeared as a name mentioned in passing, and that isn't the whole of who she is either. Lorraine moved to Burlington after college, about 2 hours from Cedar Hollow, and married a good, quiet man named Mark Ashcroft, who works in hospital administration and has never once, in 15 years of marriage to my daughter, said an unkind word about this family in my hearing, which is its own kind of quiet virtue I've come to appreciate more with age. They have 2 children, Ellie and Sam, 11 and 8, who visit less often than I'd like simply because of the drive, but who call me on the telephone most Sundays, taking turns telling me about school and soccer and, in Ellie's case lately, a persistent and detailed campaign to be allowed a dog. Lorraine works as a physical therapist, a career she chose. She's told me more than once. Partly because she liked the idea of helping people rebuild something slowly, methodically, one honest session at a time, rather than through anything dramatic or immediate. I've always thought that said something true about my daughter's whole approach to life. She does not rush things. She worked through her own grief over her mother in a slow, deliberate way that looked, from the outside, almost too calm, though I understood it, because I recognized the same instinct in myself. She and Neil were close as children. Genuinely close. The kind of closeness that survives a 4-year age gap because the older sibling decides early on to be protective rather than dismissive. It was Lorraine who taught Neil to ride a bike, actually, 2 years before I got around to it myself, patient with him in the driveway on a summer evening while I stood on the porch with Vivian, both of us laughing at how seriously our 9-year-old daughter took the responsibility of teaching her little brother something. I mention all this because I want you to understand what it actually cost Neil choosing the path he chose during those 2 years. Not just what it cost me, or what it nearly cost him financially, but what it cost between two people who used to ride bikes together in a gravel driveway, one of them patiently, generously teaching the other something neither of them ever expected to matter, as much as it eventually did. Lorraine noticed it before I let myself fully admit it. She called me in November of that year, upset in a way I hadn't heard from my daughter since she was a teenager. "Dad, Neil told me you're thinking about selling the house." I never said that. He told Mark and me at Thanksgiving that it was basically decided, that you'd agreed in principle and you were just working out logistics. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the Vermont November outside my window. My son had told his own sister that a decision I had never made was already made. Not a misunderstanding. Not an exaggeration born of hope. A specific, deliberate lie, told to isolate the one person in this family who might have stood beside me instead of against me. "It isn't decided, Lorraine. It isn't even close to decided." "Okay." She was quiet for a moment. "Dad, is everything all right out there?" "Really?" I told her it was. I've thought about that lie more than almost any other thing I said during those years, because it was the moment I chose, consciously, to keep protecting my children from each other's worst instincts, instead of simply telling the truth and letting the consequences land where they landed. The day it finally happened started like any other Tuesday. I want to tell you that because there's a temptation, telling a story like this, to make the morning of the worst day feel different somehow, foreboding, weighted. It wasn't. I had oatmeal. I read the paper. I walked out to the workshop and spent 2 hours on a chair I was restoring for the church rummage sale. A small, ordinary Tuesday, the last ordinary one I'd have for a while. Neil called around 4 and asked if he could come by that evening. Said he and Vanessa wanted to talk to me about something important, a phrase that had by then stopped meaning anything good in our family. I said, of course, come for dinner, and I made a pot roast, because some habits outlast the reasons you built them. They arrived at 7. Vanessa carried a folder I recognized from the pharmacy on Main Street, the kind with a clear plastic cover, and she set it on the counter without a word while Neil made small talk about the drive over, about traffic that doesn't exist in Cedar Hollow, about nothing at all. We ate. I want to be honest that the dinner itself was almost pleasant, which in hindsight I understand was deliberate. Neil has always been better at performing normalcy than his mother ever gave him credit for, and I think some part of him needed that hour of pretending everything was fine before he could do what he'd come to do. It was Vanessa who moved first, once the plates were cleared. She reached for the folder. "Harold, we need to talk seriously about the house." "We've talked about the house." "We've talked around the house," Neil said. "Dad, I'm going to be straight with you, because I think that's what you'd want. The business is in real trouble. I owe about $140,000 on equipment I can't sell for what I owe on it. And the bank's been calling. I need help, and I need it in a way that actually solves the problem, not another loan I can't pay back. I've told you I'd help with what I can. What you can isn't enough, Dad. It hasn't been enough for 2 years. But this house could actually fix it. All of it. And I've talked to a lawyer, a real one, and he drew up a simple transfer. You'd deed the house to me and Vanessa. We'd take over the taxes, the insurance, everything. You'd have a place to live as long as you want it, Informally, we'd never actually make you leave, but the ownership would be settled, and I could use it as collateral to refinance the equipment and save the business. I looked at the folder on the counter. I looked at my son's face, which had gone the particular red it always went when he was asking for something he already suspected he shouldn't be asking for. And if I say no, that was when Vanessa's composure finally cracked. Just slightly. Just enough for me to see what had actually been sitting underneath 2 years of careful concern. "Then maybe it's time you found out what it's like to actually take care of yourself out here," she said. "Because we can't keep doing this, Harold. We can't keep managing your life and getting nothing in return except being told to wait." Neil stood up. He walked to the hook by the back door, my hook, the one that had held my keys for 40 years, and he took them off it, and he held them up, and something in his voice broke open into something I had genuinely never heard from him before. Not once, not in 38 years. "Sign it, Dad, or get out tonight." I sat there for a moment in the particular silence that follows a sentence like that. A silence with its own weight, its own temperature. Then I stood up, slowly, the way a man my age has to stand up from anything. And I walked to the counter, and I opened the folder. I want to tell you what was actually in that document, because the details matter, and because I think most people watching a scene like that from the outside assume legal paperwork is more mysterious than it usually is. It was a quitclaim deed, 3 pages, drafted. I'd learn later, not by an actual real estate attorney, but by a paralegal at a general practice firm in Rutland that Neil's coworker had used for a divorce, working from a template the firm kept on file and adjusted for whatever came through the door. Standard language on the first 2 pages. Grantor conveys all right, title, and interest in the described property to grantee, subject to any existing encumbrances of record. Legal description of the 11 acres. Copied, I could tell, directly from the county assessor's parcel record. A notary block at the bottom, already filled in with the name of a notary who worked at Neil's own bank, ready to be called over the moment I signed. I read all 3 pages standing at that counter, slowly, while my son and his wife watched me the way you'd watch a man diffusing something, and near the bottom of the 3rd page, tucked into a paragraph of otherwise unremarkable boilerplate, I found the sentence that made me pick up the pen instead of putting the folder down. I'm not going to tell you yet what that sentence said. I didn't fully explain it to Neil that night either, and there's a reason for that, which I'll get to. What I will tell you is what I felt, reading it, not relief, exactly, not yet. Something closer to recognition. The particular feeling of watching a door you'd quietly kept unlocked for years finally get walked through by someone who had no idea it had ever been anything but locked. I signed. My hand was steady. I want to correct something I said earlier because I told you my hands weren't shaking. And that's true. But I want to be honest, that something in me was shaking anyway, somewhere further down than my hands. The part of a man that still, even at 71, even after everything, wants his son to have simply asked him properly, instead of screaming at him over a set of keys. Vanessa called the notary over. She'd been waiting in her car the whole time, it turned out. A woman named Dana, who worked the drive-through window at Neil's bank, and had apparently agreed to come out on a Tuesday night as a favor. Dana stamped the document, barely glancing at it, the way people do a task they've done 10,000 times before, and stopped truly looking at somewhere around the 2000th. I want to tell you a little more about Dana, because there's a detail about her role that night that Neil never fully processed, and I think it's worth including. Dana Pelletier had been a commissioned notary for about 6 years by then, mostly using it for routine bank business, signature guarantees, the occasional loan document. She agreed to come out that night as a personal favor to Vanessa, who knew her slightly through a mutual friend. And I don't believe, watching her that evening, that she had any idea she was walking into anything other than a routine family property transfer. A notary's job is narrow and specific, to verify that the person signing a document is who they claim to be, and that they're signing willingly without coercion. Dana did that job correctly as far as it goes. She checked my driver's license, asked me directly, in front of Neil and Vanessa, whether I was signing of my own free will, and I answered honestly that I was, which was true, in its own strange way, even under the circumstances. What a notary is not required to do, and what Dana had no obligation or particular reason to do, is read and understand the substantive legal content of what's being signed. That's not negligence on her part. That's simply not what the job is. I've thought about Dana a fair amount since. An ordinary young woman doing an ordinary favor for a family she barely knew, stamping a document that would go on to embarrass a man she'd probably never see again after that night. I don't think she did anything wrong. I think she's simply one more example of how a plan like Neil's depends, at every single step, on nobody. The room actually stopping to look closely at what's in front of them. Not the son pushing the folder across the table. Not the wife who'd been waiting 2 years for this exact moment. And not the notary hired at the last minute specifically because she'd ask the fewest questions and take the least amount of time. Neil hugged me. I want you to know that. My son hugged me hard, the way he used to hug me as a boy after a Little League game we'd won, and he said, "Thank you, Dad. You have no idea what this means." And for just a moment, one single moment, standing in that kitchen, I let myself believe that the hug was actually about me and not about 11 acres. They celebrated that night in a way I found, even then, almost unbearably fast. Vanessa opened a bottle of wine she'd apparently brought with her, tucked in her bag the whole evening, prepared in advance for a victory she'd been certain of before she ever walked through my door. Neil called his business partner from my own kitchen phone, laughing, saying words like refinance and equity, and finally, and I stood at my own sink washing the pot roast dish. An old man in his own kitchen watching two people celebrate the acquisition of his life like it was a property closing, because to them, that's exactly what it was. "We should get this recorded first thing tomorrow," Vanessa said, tucking the folder into her bag. "Get it official." "First thing," Neil agreed. I dried my hands on the dish towel that had hung on that same oven handle for as long as I could remember, and I said, mildly, the way you'd mentioned that it might rain tomorrow. "You really should read the whole thing before you file it, Neil." He laughed. He actually laughed, warm and easy, already 3 glasses of wine into a celebration that would not survive the following afternoon. "I trust you, Dad. As long as your name's on that line, we're good. I want to tell you about that night itself, after Neil and Vanessa finally left, because I've told you what happened at the table, and I haven't yet told you what the hours in between actually held." They left around 10, still celebrating. Vanessa's arm looped through Neil's as they walked to their car, both of them talking too fast, too loud. The particular energy of people who believe they've just solved a problem that's been sitting on their chest for years. I stood on my own porch and watched their taillights disappear down that gravel road. And then I went back inside to a kitchen that suddenly felt enormous and quiet in exactly the way it hadn't felt in 50 years of actually living in it. I didn't sleep much. I sat at that same table for a long while. The folder gone with Vanessa, but the memory of it sitting there entirely intact, and I let myself feel, finally, alone, without an audience. Everything I hadn't allowed myself to show in front of my son. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to grief. Grief for a version of Neil I'd been quietly mourning for 2 years without ever using that specific word for it. Grief for an evening that should have been, by any reasonable measure, one of the worst nights of my life, and yet had also required me to perform a kind of calm I genuinely felt. Standing right alongside a private devastation I genuinely also felt, both of them true at exactly the same time. I got up around midnight and walked out to the workshop, not to work on anything, just to stand in it, surrounded by my father's tools and 32 years of my own accumulated sawdust, and I said, out loud, to an empty building, "I hope you're right about this, Dad." I don't know exactly who I was talking to. Some combination, I think, of my father specifically and whatever larger sense of rightness in the world I still, at 71, occasionally find myself appealing to. The strange detail, the thing that should have stopped Neil cold if he'd been paying even the smallest bit of attention, wasn't hidden. That's the part I want you to understand, because I never once lied to my son that night, and I never will have to, because I never needed to. The truth was sitting right there on the page in 12-point font, exactly where anyone reading carefully would have found it. It happened the next morning. Neil called at 9. His voice different than I'd heard it in years. Tight, careful. The particular carefulness of a man who has just been handed information he doesn't yet fully understand, but already senses is bad. "Dad, I took the deed down to the county recorder's office this morning to file it. The clerk, she wouldn't record it. Not without a supplemental affidavit. She said there's a reference in here to a prior instrument she needs a copy of before she can process anything. Which line, Neil? There was a pause, the sound of paper being handled on the other end. Hang on. Page 3, near the bottom. It says, this conveyance is made subject to that certain reservation of a life estate as more fully described in the last will and testament of Elias J. Bramwell, admitted to probate in Windsor County, state of Vermont, in the year 1986, and to the remainder interest created thereunder. He read it slowly, the way you read something in a language you technically know but have never had to actually use before. Dad, what is this? What's a life estate? And whose remainder interest? What does remainder even mean here? I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd shown me that document 12 hours earlier, and I looked out the window at the 11 acres my son believed, as of the previous night, had finally become his. Neil, I said, I think it's time we had a longer conversation than the one we had last night. I should tell you about the clerk at the county recorder's office, too. A woman named Patricia Lozel, who's worked that counter for going on 19 years, because her small, ordinary diligence that Wednesday morning is the entire reason any of this came to light the way it did, instead of quietly slipping through unnoticed. Neil told me later exactly how the conversation went. He'd walked in with the deed, expecting a routine filing, the kind of transaction that usually takes a clerk about 4 minutes to process. Patricia read through it the way she reads through every document that crosses her counter. And when she hit that reference to my father's 1986 will, she stopped, pulled up the probate record on her own computer out of simple procedural thoroughness, and told Neil, politely but firmly, that she couldn't record a conveyance referencing a prior instrument without a supplemental affidavit clarifying the current status of that life estate. Neil told me he'd been irritated at the time, assumed it was bureaucratic overcaution, asked her if there was any way to just push it through. She told him, he said, that she'd been doing this job long enough to know that a 5-minute delay checking something properly was always cheaper, for everyone involved, than the alternative. He didn't understand, standing at that counter, how correct she actually was, or how much that particular 5 minutes of unglamorous, unremarkable diligence was about to unravel. I've never met Patricia Lozel myself, though I understand she's been at that counter long enough that half the county has a story like this one. Some small, quiet correction she made simply by doing her job properly, instead of rushing a document through to clear her queue. I think about her sometimes, an ordinary civil servant nobody will ever make a movie about, who did more to protect my daughter's inheritance in 4 minutes of careful reading than any dramatic intervention could have managed. I want to tell you about the specific week before the ultimatum, too, because I've moved somewhat quickly from the pressure kept building to the ultimatum happened. And there's one more concrete incident that belongs in between, the one that I now understand was probably the final trigger for Neil's decision to act. 10 days before that Tuesday, Neil's bank called him directly about the equipment loans, informing him that if he couldn't provide updated collateral or a substantial payment within 30 days, they'd begin formal default proceedings. He told me about that call only much later, after everything else had already happened, but I understood, hearing about it in retrospect, exactly what had actually been sitting behind his sudden screaming urgency that Tuesday night. It wasn't simply accumulated frustration finally boiling over. It was a specific, concrete deadline, a bank's own calendar pressing down on my son's calendar, and he'd apparently decided, in the 10 days between that call and the night he showed up at my door, that the fastest possible solution was also the only one he had time left to pursue. I don't say this to excuse the screaming, or the keys, or the folder. I say it because I think it matters to understanding why that particular Tuesday, out of 2 years of building pressure, was the night it all finally came to a head. My son wasn't simply losing patience with an old process. He was running out of actual time, in a very literal bank calendar sense, and fear given a deadline behaves very differently than fear given an open horizon. He came out that afternoon, alone this time, without Vanessa, which told me something on its own. I sat him down at that same kitchen table, and I told him calmly, the way I'd tell him anything, that the house had never fully been mine to give away. Not because of any trick I'd played, not because of anything hidden or dishonest, but because my own father, his grandfather, had structured his will that way 39 years ago, in a decision that had nothing to do with Neil at all, and everything to do with a man who'd watched his own two brothers destroy their relationship over a property dispute back in the 1950s, and had decided, when it came time to write his own will, that he was not going to let the same thing happen to his grandchildren. He gave me what's called a life estate, I told Neil. It means I get to live in this house, use it, enjoy it, for the rest of my life. It does not mean I own it outright, the way most people assume their parents just own their house. I never had the full title to give you. Neil, nobody could have signed that house over to you last night. Not me, not a court, not anybody. Then who owns it? Nobody does. Not yet. What your grandfather set up is called a remainder interest, and it's already been sitting there, recorded at the county courthouse, since 1986. When I die, this house passes automatically, not through a will, not through probate, automatically the way water runs downhill, to whoever holds that remainder interest. Neil's face had gone very still. Who holds it, Dad? I looked at my son for a long moment before I answered, because I wanted him to sit inside that question for a second before I gave him the rest of it. You and your sister. Equally. 50% each. It's been that way since before you could walk, Neil, because there was never any reason for you to know until you decided you needed to know. I want to pause the story for a moment and explain something plainly, because I think anyone listening to this who owns property, or expects to inherit any, deserves to understand the actual mechanics of what happened in my kitchen that night, not just the emotional shape of it. A life estate is not an unusual or exotic legal tool. It's one of the oldest concepts in American property law, inherited from English common law centuries ago, and it's used constantly, quietly, in ordinary families every single year. A parent who wants to guarantee a surviving spouse can live in the family home for life, while still ensuring the house eventually passes to children from an earlier marriage. A farmer who wants to keep working his land until he dies, while guaranteeing it goes to a specific grandchild afterward, rather than getting divided and sold off. A grandparent, like mine, who wants to protect an inheritance from being manipulated away from one beneficiary by another. The mechanism is simple once you understand it. Ownership of real property in this country isn't actually one single thing. It's a bundle of separate rights that can be split apart and distributed differently. The right to live somewhere, the right to profit from it, the right to eventually own it outright once a specific condition is met, usually somebody's death. A life estate simply takes that bundle and divides it cleanly. One person gets everything except the ability to permanently dispose of it. And specific other people, the remainder men, already hold, from the very moment the life estate is created, a real, legally enforceable claim to what's left once the life tenant is gone. The reason this mattered so much in my situation is that a life tenant cannot convey more than they actually possess. I could not sign away Neil and Lorraine's remainder interest that Tuesday night for the same reason I couldn't have sold you my neighbor's truck. It simply was never mine to give. The most I could have transferred, even at gunpoint, would have been my own life estate itself, a right tied entirely to my own lifespan, worthless as loan collateral, worthless to sell outright, worthless for nearly anything except the one thing it was always meant for, living in that house until I die. Anybody reading a deed, a will, or a trust document involving a family member ought to look specifically for language like this: reservation of life estate, remainder interest, right of occupancy. These words show up more often than people expect, especially in older families, especially in properties that have passed down more than one generation. And they mean, very simply, that the person signing in front of you might not actually possess the full authority everyone in the room is assuming they possess. I'd encourage anyone in a position like mine, holding property that's meant to eventually protect more than one person, to consider exactly this kind of structure, put in place calmly, years before any pressure ever arrives, rather than scrambled together defensively once a crisis is already at your kitchen table. I want to tell you about my father's brothers, because I think it's the only way to make sense of why a stonecutter from a small Vermont town would go to the trouble, in 1986, of structuring his will with language most people in this county had never once needed in their entire lives. My father had two brothers, Walter and Cyrus, and the three of them had inherited a working farm from their own father in 1958, 60 acres and a dairy barn, split evenly on paper, but never once, in practice, managed as anything close to equal. Walter, the oldest, took over the day-to-day running of it, and, over about 11 years, quietly convinced their aging mother, who still held a portion of the deed until her own death, to sign increasingly generous documents in his favor. By the time she died in 1969, Walter controlled nearly the whole farm. And Cyrus, the youngest, gentlest of the three, a man who'd spent those same 11 years, simply trusting that family meant something, walked away with almost nothing, and a bitterness that lasted the rest of his life. He and my father barely spoke for the last 20 years Cyrus was alive. I met my Uncle Cyrus perhaps 6 times in my entire childhood, always at a neutral location, always briefly, always with my father unusually quiet for days afterward. My father watched that happen to his own family, watched a good, trusting brother get slowly written out of his own inheritance by a combination of patience and paperwork nobody thought to question until it was already finished. And he told me once, not long before he died, that he'd made himself a promise sitting in a lawyer's office in 1986, updating his own will after a minor stroke had reminded him he wasn't going to live forever. "I'm not going to let paper do to my grandchildren what it did to my brother," he told me. "You're a good man, Harold, and I trust you completely. But I'm not writing a will that trusts you completely. I'm writing one that doesn't need to." I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time. I understand it now with a clarity that sometimes keeps me up at night, because my own son, 39 years later, tried to do to his own sister exactly what my Uncle Walter did to my father's brother. Not through 11 years of patient manipulation of an aging parent's signature, but through a single kitchen table ultimatum that my father's foresight, decades before either of us knew Neil would ever exist, had already rendered entirely powerless. I've kept a copy of my father's will in a fireproof box in the workshop for 39 years, alongside the original probate documents, not out of paranoia, but out of respect. Respect for a document my father had labored over carefully, at a lawyer's office, in the specific hope that his family would never need to look at it in anger. I never explained the arrangement to Neil in detail, because it never seemed relevant while my children got along, and because some part of me, I'll admit now, didn't want either of my children thinking about property while I was still alive to hand them anything at all. I wanted them to love each other for reasons that had nothing to do with 11 acres in Cedar Hollow. I understand now that silence was its own kind of mistake. Not because the arrangement failed, it did exactly what my father built it to do, but because Neil spent years operating on an assumption I could have corrected at any point, and chose, out of a strange tangle of love and pride and grief over his mother, not to. I should tell you about Bernard Kessling, because he handled far more than a single quitclaim deed's aftermath, and because he'd been a part of this family's story for longer than Neil had been alive. Bernard and I met in 1979, when I hired him to help draft a straightforward will of my own back when Neil was an infant, and the whole idea of estate planning felt almost comically premature. He'd taken over his own father's small practice in Rutland 2 years earlier, and something about his careful, unhurried manner appealed to me immediately. The same quality, I think now, that I'd eventually come to recognize as a kind of kinship. 2 men who'd both learned, in different professions, that patience outperforms urgency more often than people expect. Bernard had handled my father's estate too, back in 1986, which meant he was the one who'd actually drafted the language Neil eventually stumbled over in that county recorder's office 39 years later. He remembered my father well. Remembered, specifically, the afternoon Elias Bramwell sat in his office and explained, haltingly, awkwardly, a man uncomfortable, discussing his own brother's failures out loud, exactly what had happened to Cyrus, and exactly what he wanted to make sure never happened to his own grandchildren. "Your father cried in my office that day, Harold," Bernard told me. The week after Neil's deed came back unrecordable, the 2 of us sitting in the same Rutland office where it had all been decided 39 years earlier. Not for long, just for a moment, telling me about his brother. I don't think I ever told you that before. I didn't think it was mine to tell, while he was still deciding whether the whole family needed to know the details or not. I sat with that information for a long while after Bernard told me, understanding my father a little differently than I had before, not simply as a careful, foresighted man, but as a man who had carried genuine grief about his own brother for decades, quietly enough that even his own son had never fully seen the weight of it, and had turned that grief, in the end, into the single most protective act of his entire life. I want to give you one more scene from 1986, because I've told you what my father said to Bernard in that office. But I want to give you the fuller picture of that particular season in his life, since I lived through most of it alongside him, a 34-year-old man watching his own father confront mortality for the first time. The stroke that prompted the will update was minor, by medical standards. A brief numbness in his left hand, a slight slur in his speech that resolved within days. The kind of event doctors call a warning, rather than a catastrophe. But my father was 61 years old that year, and I remember him telling me, sitting in the hospital waiting room while they ran their tests, that a warning at 61 lands differently than a warning at 34. That a man starts doing arithmetic about remaining time in a way he simply doesn't before that first small failure of his own body. He spent nearly 3 months after that stroke thinking through the will, more time than the document itself would seem to justify. And I understood only much later that most of that time wasn't spent on legal language at all. It was spent on the emotional work of finally, fully processing what had happened to his own brother 30 years earlier, grief he'd apparently been carrying, mostly silently, for 3 decades. He drove into Rutland to see Bernard 4 separate times that autumn, each visit a little more resolved than the last. And I remember him coming home from that final visit, the one where he actually signed everything, looking lighter than I'd seen him look in years, the particular lightness of a man who has finally, after decades, done something concrete with a grief that had nowhere else to go. I didn't ask him much about it, at the time. I was 34, with 2 young children of my own, too absorbed in my own life to fully register what my father was working through. I understand now that I owe him an apology I can never actually deliver, for not paying closer attention while he was still here to receive it. I drove out to see my Uncle Cyrus's grave the week after that conversation with Bernard, something I hadn't done in probably a decade, out in the small cemetery behind the Baptist church 2 towns over where our family has buried its dead for 5 generations. Cyrus died in 1994, alone, in a small rented apartment in Bennington, a man who'd never fully recovered, financially or otherwise, from what his own brother did to him in the 1960s. I stood at that headstone for a long while, an old man talking to granite the way old men sometimes do, and I told him what had happened, told him about the claws, about Neil, about my own father's quiet 39-year-old promise finally doing exactly what it was built to do. I don't know what I expected to feel standing there. What I actually felt was a kind of grief I hadn't fully processed before, not for myself, not even entirely for Cyrus, but for the specific loneliness of a man who'd spent the last 30 years of his own life certain that family, in the end, simply couldn't be trusted with anything that mattered. I wondered, standing there, whether Cyrus ever knew what my father had done, decades after his own ordeal, to make sure it never happened again to anyone else in this family. I wondered if it would have changed anything for him to know it, or whether some wounds simply outlast any comfort that arrives after the fact. I left a small stone on top of his headstone, the old custom, and I told him, out loud, alone in that cemetery, that his brother had finally found a way to make it right, even if it took 39 years and a grandson neither of them ever met to prove it. The consequences unfolded slowly, the way consequences built on paperwork usually do, without a single dramatic courtroom scene, without anyone raising their voice again after that Tuesday night. The deed itself, once the county recorder's office flagged it, could not be filed as written. Neil's attorney, the one from the general practice firm, the one who'd apparently never bothered to run a full title search before drafting a 3-page template, called me directly. Apologetic in the careful way professionals get apologetic when they realize they've made an error that could follow them. He explained that the deed I'd signed was not invalid, exactly, but that it could only ever convey what I actually possessed, my own life estate, which meant that even on paper, even with my signature on it, all Neil had actually acquired was the right to occupy the house for the remainder of my natural life. An interest that, upon my death, would immediately terminate and mean absolutely nothing. since the full ownership would pass directly and automatically to Neil and Lorraine as designated in my father's will, regardless of any deed I'd signed in between. In practical terms, Neil had spent an entire evening pressuring his father into signing over something that, even in the best possible reading for him, was worth almost nothing. A temporary right tied to my own lifespan, non-transferable to a bank as meaningful collateral, worthless as an asset to refinance equipment against, because no lender in the state was going to extend real money against an interest that could vanish the moment I happened to die. The bank he'd hoped to use it with confirmed exactly that within a week. I heard about it from Lorraine, who'd heard about it from Neil directly, in one of the first honest conversations the two of them had had in over a year. "They laughed at him, Dad," she told me over the phone. Not unkindly, more disbelieving than anything. The loan officer actually laughed, apparently. Said in 20 years he'd never seen someone try to collateralize a life estate for an equipment refinance. I want to be honest that I felt something complicated hearing that. Not triumph, exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't some small, ungenerous part of me that felt a flicker of it. Mostly what I felt was a kind of exhausted sadness. The sadness of watching a plan fail not because I had cleverly stopped it, but because it had never once been capable of succeeding. And my son had spent 2 years of his marriage and his relationship with his sister, and ultimately his relationship with me, chasing something that basic legal literacy would have told him was never really there. Lorraine's reaction, once she understood the full picture, surprised me. I'd half expected anger at Neil, and there was some of that, but mostly what I heard from my daughter was relief. Relief that the thing she'd been quietly suspecting for 2 years, that Neil was maneuvering to cut her out entirely, had turned out to be legally impossible from the very beginning, whether or not Neil himself had ever known it. "He can't cut me out, Dad." He never could have. Grandpa made sure of that 39 years before Neil even thought to try. She drove out that weekend, the first time in nearly 8 months, and we sat on the front porch, the one built around my own father's granite steps, and she cried for a while. And then she laughed, a strange, tired, relieved laugh, and she said, "I always thought I was being paranoid, feeling like Neil was trying to write me out of something. I wasn't paranoid. I was just wrong about whether it would actually work." I didn't hear from Neil directly for 11 days after that phone call with his lawyer. 11 days of silence from a son who had, until that point, called or texted nearly every week for years, however manipulative some of those calls had ultimately been. I want to tell you what those 11 days actually felt like from my side of it, because I've described them mostly as a fact. Neil didn't call, without describing what living inside that fact was actually like. I didn't know during those 11 days whether my son was quietly consulting lawyers or nursing a private fury at me for something I hadn't actually done to him, or simply too embarrassed to speak to anyone at all. I didn't know whether he blamed me, blamed himself, blamed his own attorney for the sloppy title work, or some shifting combination of all three depending on the hour. I spent those 11 days doing ordinary things with an unusual amount of deliberate attention, cooking full meals, instead of the simple ones I usually made for myself alone, walking the property line most mornings, calling Lorraine most evenings not to discuss Neil specifically, just to hear my daughter's voice, and be reminded that at least one relationship in this family hadn't just been tested past its limits. Gordon came by twice during those 11 days, both times with coffee, both times asking nothing. Bernard called once, checking in, professional, but genuinely warm underneath it, telling me he'd handled plenty of family estate disputes over 4 decades, and that the silence after a failed maneuver like Neil's was almost always the hardest part, harder even than the confrontation itself, because confrontation at least gives both people something to actively do. I want to tell you about running into a former student during that same stretch, because it happened in the middle of those 11 days, and it mattered more than a chance grocery store encounter probably should have. Her name is Denise Corvo now, Denise Fournier, when she sat in my 3rd period chemistry class in 1994, and she stopped me in the cereal aisle, genuinely delighted, the way former students often are when they run into a teacher who mattered to them years after the fact. "Mr. Bramwell, I don't know if you remember me, but you're the reason I ended up a nurse. That whole unit on stoichiometry, you made me stay after twice a week for a month until it clicked, and I never forgot that you didn't just let me fail quietly." I did remember her, actually, though I didn't say so immediately. wanting to see if she'd fill in the details herself first, the way I used to test a student's own memory before confirming mine. We talked for nearly 20 minutes in that aisle, about her 3 children, her nursing career at the hospital in Rutland, and near the end of the conversation, she said something I've held on to since. You know, my own dad's getting up there too, and I worry about him constantly, whether he's managing okay out on the farm, whether my brother's looking out for him the right way. It's good to see you looking so well. Mr. Bramwell, some of us worry about the wrong things sometimes when it's really our job to just show up and ask, not assume. I didn't tell her what I was actually dealing with that week. It wasn't the moment for it. And it wasn't information a former student needed to carry out of a cereal aisle conversation. But I thought about her words for days afterward. Some of us worry about the wrong things sometimes, and I understood, more clearly than I had in the abstract, exactly the difference between the kind of worry that shows up simply to ask, and the kind that shows up already certain, it knows the answer, and only needs a signature to make it official. I thought, more than once during those 11 days, about simply calling Neil myself, breaking the silence before he found his own way to break it. I didn't. I've asked myself since whether that was wisdom or a kind of quiet punishment I wasn't fully willing to admit to myself I was administering, and I honestly don't have a clean answer. I think it was probably some of both, the way most human choices turn out to be some of both, when you look at them closely enough. He came out on a Saturday, alone, in the same truck he'd been driving for 6 years, the same truck that had been part of the financial trouble that started all of this. He sat on the porch steps instead of coming inside, which felt, at the time, like its own kind of statement. I looked it up, he said, without any preamble. Life estates. Remainder interests. I spent about 4 hours online after the bank called, reading everything I could find, and then I called a real estate attorney myself. Paid for an actual consultation this time. And he told me everything you'd already told me was completely accurate. There's nothing to contest. There's no argument. Grandpa built it, so there couldn't be one. That's right. Why didn't you ever tell me, Dad? Not that night. Before all of it. Why did you let me spend 2 years planning around a house that was never actually mine to plan around? I thought carefully about how to answer that, because I owed him something honest, even then, even after everything. Because for most of your life, Neil, there was no reason to. You and your sister loved each other. This house was just the place you grew up in, not a math problem. I didn't withhold it from you to trap you. I withheld it because I never imagined a version of you that would need to be trapped by it. And by the time I understood that version of you existed, I think some part of me was testing whether you'd ask me honestly for help before you tried to simply take it. Neil sat with that for a long moment, looking out at the same 11 acres he'd been so certain 12 days earlier belonged to him. I failed that test. You did. Vanessa and I have been fighting about it every day since the bank called. She thinks I should have known. I think I should have known too. I think I wanted the house to fix a problem badly enough that I stopped asking myself basic questions I would have asked about literally anyone else's property. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Dad, I know that doesn't undo any of it. I screamed at you. I took your keys off the hook like you were a tenant who'd stopped paying rent. I did that to you in your own kitchen. I didn't say it was all right, because it wasn't. And I've decided, at 71 years old, that I'm no longer willing to say things are all right simply to make an uncomfortable moment end faster. I appreciate you saying that, Neil. I do. But an apology after the bank laughs at you isn't quite the same thing as an apology that would have come if the plan had actually worked. I need some time to know which one this is. I've been asked since all of this settled, whether I anticipated Neil's ultimatum specifically, whether some part of me had been quietly waiting, for 2 years, for exactly the scene that played out in my kitchen that Tuesday night. I want to answer that as honestly as I can, because I think the honest answer is more interesting than either version people usually want to hear. I did not know it would happen exactly that way. I did not know there would be a folder, a pen from the credit union, my own keys held up like a threat. But I want to be honest that I had, over those 2 years, begun to understand that some version of a forced choice was coming. The way you understand a storm is coming from the particular color the sky turns hours before the first drop actually falls. I didn't engineer the confrontation. I simply stopped being surprised by the direction the pressure was heading. And somewhere in that stopped surprise, I think, I quietly decided I was not going to fight the moment when it arrived. I was going to let it arrive completely, Let Neil say whatever he'd built himself up to say, and see with total clarity exactly what my son had become capable of when he believed nobody was going to stop him. That's not quite the same as testing him, though I understand why it might look that way from the outside. I wasn't running an experiment. I was simply refusing to spend my last good years flinching in advance of a blow that, as it turned out, I was never actually going to feel. I should tell you about Mark Ashcroft's role in all of this, because he stayed almost entirely in the background of this story so far, and that's mostly accurate to how he conducts himself in general, but it isn't the whole picture. Mark called me the week after everything came out, a call I hadn't expected, since Mark and I have always had a pleasant but fairly reserved relationship. The kind two men build when one of them married into the other's family, and neither is inclined toward unnecessary intimacy. Harold, I just wanted to say, Lorraine told me everything, and I wanted you to know. I've thought Neil was heading somewhere bad for a while now. I never said anything because it wasn't my place, and because Lorraine and Neil have always had their own relationship, I didn't want to complicate. But I want you to know Lorraine's had my full support this whole time, in case that matters to you at all. It mattered more than Mark probably realized, hearing a quiet, careful man state plainly that he'd seen the same pattern I had from the outside, without ever once inserting himself into a family dynamic that wasn't strictly his to manage. I think there's a particular kind of loyalty in that restraint. A man who loved my daughter enough to support her fully, while still respecting that some battles genuinely weren't his to fight directly. I met with Bernard again in September. Not about Neil's failed deed this time, but about my own will, which I hadn't touched since Vivian died 6 years earlier. We sat in his office for the better part of 2 hours, going through the same careful, unhurried process my own father had gone through in that same building 39 years before. And I found myself, more than once during that meeting, thinking about Elias Bramwell sitting in a similar chair, working through a similar grief, trying to build something that would outlast his own ability to personally enforce fairness. I didn't change the fundamental structure. The house still passes to Neil and Lorraine equally, exactly as my father intended, and I've decided that structure was correct 39 years ago and remains correct now, regardless of what Neil tried to do with a folder and a pen from the credit union. What I did add, with Bernard's careful help, was a letter, not a legal document, just a letter, to be read by both of my children together, whenever the day comes that this house actually does pass to them. I've decided I can share a little of what it actually says, since I think it belongs at the end of this story as much as it belongs in that eventual envelope. I wrote that I hoped, by the time either of them read it, that the events of these 2 years had become simply a hard chapter in a longer, better story, rather than the whole of what they remembered about each other. I wrote that their grandfather built this protection not because he distrusted his own son, but because he loved his grandchildren enough to guard against a version of the future he hoped, genuinely hoped, would never actually arrive. I wrote that I hoped the same thing myself, writing it, even knowing, by then, that one small version of that feared future had already arrived, and already been quietly defeated by the very protection built against it. I wrote one more thing, near the end of that letter, that I'll share here because I think it's the truest sentence in the whole document. I wrote, "The house was never the inheritance. The inheritance was watching two people who loved each other choose, eventually, to keep loving each other anyway, once the money stopped being the loudest thing in the room." I want to be honest about a moment of doubt I had, somewhere in the middle of those 2 years, that I haven't fully told you about yet. There was an evening, sometime in early 2023, sitting alone after another uncomfortable dinner with Neil and Vanessa, when I genuinely considered simply telling Neil the truth outright, explaining the life estate, the remainder interest, all of it, calmly and directly, before any ultimatum ever had the chance to happen. I picked up the phone twice that evening to call him. I put it down both times. I've asked myself since whether that was wisdom or cowardice, whether I withheld the truth to protect my son from his own worst impulse, or whether some smaller, less generous part of me wanted to see exactly how far he'd actually go before the truth stopped him. I don't have a fully honest answer to that question even now, and I've decided I'm not going to pretend I do, simply because the ending turned out well enough to make the question feel less urgent than it once did. I think the honest answer is that I was afraid that telling him outright would simply teach him the specific limits of what he could get away with, rather than teaching him anything true about how a family is actually supposed to treat each other. I don't know if that fear was correct. I only know it was real, and it was mine, and it shaped a silence that cost my son 2 years he didn't need to spend chasing something that was never actually available to him. It's been 8 months now since that Tuesday night, and I want to tell you honestly what's actually changed, because I think stories like this one owe their audience an ending that resembles real life more than it resembles a movie. The business trouble that started all of this never fully resolved the way Neil hoped. He lost 2 of his 4 employees over the following winter, sold the second excavator at a loss, and now runs Bramwell Grounds and Grading as a smaller operation, mostly residential work. Mostly himself and one other man. A business about half the size of what it was at its peak. I helped him, eventually, in a way that had nothing to do with the house. I co-signed a modest loan, $22,000, enough to consolidate his highest interest equipment debt into something manageable, with a repayment schedule we wrote down together, in plain language, both of us signing it in front of my own attorney this time, not a paralegal working from a template. I want to tell you what actually happened to that business in full, because a story like this one owes you the complete financial picture, not just the emotional one. The consolidation loan helped, but it didn't fix everything on its own. Neil made the harder decision, that same winter, to let go of the Rutland development contract entirely, formally withdrawing from a project that had been quietly bleeding him for years, taking a modest loss on the equipment he'd financed against it, rather than continuing to wait on a resolution that showed no signs of actually arriving. It was, by his own account, one of the hardest business decisions he's ever made. Admitting a 2-year mistake was actually over rather than continuing to hope it might still turn around. The company that survived that decision is smaller, leaner, focused almost entirely on residential landscaping and small commercial grounds contracts within about a 30-mile radius. Work that's less glamorous than the big development contract he'd once hoped would make his career, but work that pays reliably, on terms he actually controls. He's down to 2 employees now, himself included, though he's told me he's hoping to hire a 3rd by next spring if the summer season goes the way he's projecting. I don't know that Neil's business will ever be what he once imagined it becoming. I don't know that it needs to be. I think watching him rebuild it smaller and more carefully these past several months, that he's learned something about the difference between growth built on genuine capacity and growth built on hope alone. A lesson that cost him considerably more than it should have, but one I believe, watching him now, has genuinely landed. Why would you help me after everything? He asked me, the day we signed it. Because you asked me properly this time, Neil. You sat across from me and told me the actual number and asked what I could realistically do, instead of putting a folder in front of me with a deadline attached. That's the difference. That was always going to be the difference. I want to tell you a little about what happened between Neil and Vanessa in the months after the deed came back unrecordable, not because I was present for any of it directly, but because Neil eventually told me himself, in one of the more searching conversations we've had since all of this started. We fought for weeks, he told me, sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon that spring. Really fought, Dad. Vanessa kept saying I should have known, should have had a lawyer actually check the title before any of this. And I kept saying she was the one who pushed for the whole thing to happen fast, before you had time to really think it over. We both said things we probably shouldn't have. I asked him if they'd considered counseling. We did, actually. Started in January. It's helped some. Our counselor said something I keep coming back to, that Vanessa and I built our whole plan around what we were afraid of losing instead of what we actually wanted, and that those 2 things point you in really different directions if you let them. He was quiet for a moment. I think that's true, Dad. I think I spent 2 years so scared of losing the business that I never once actually asked myself what kind of father I wanted to be to Caleb and Molly. I just assumed protecting them meant getting them money, whatever it cost to get there. I didn't offer him easy comfort in that moment because I don't think easy comfort was what he needed. I told him that fear makes reasonable people do things that look, from the outside, almost unrecognizable, and that the work now wasn't in explaining the fear away, but in learning to notice it early enough, next time, to make a different choice before it drove him somewhere he'd regret. Vanessa and Neil are still married, still working through whatever needs working through between them, and I've decided that's their business to manage, not mine to referee. I see improvement when I see them together. I also see still A caution in Vanessa that I don't think fully existed before all of this. A watchfulness that suggests she's still working out exactly how much of what happened was genuinely her own fear talking, and how much was something colder than fear that she hasn't fully reckoned with yet. Vanessa and I have not fully repaired anything, and I don't know that we will. She apologized once, in October, a careful, somewhat rehearsed apology that felt more like damage control than genuine reckoning, and I accepted it the way you accept an apology from someone you no longer fully trust, politely, without pretending it changes very much. She stopped coming to most of the smaller, ordinary gatherings, though she still shows up for the major holidays, careful and a little quieter than she used to be. I don't know whether that pattern is her choice or Neil's, and I've decided I don't need to know. Lorraine and Neil are speaking again, carefully, the way siblings rebuild something after one of them has genuinely hurt the other. She's made it clear to him, in a conversation I wasn't present for but heard about from both of them separately, that she doesn't want the remainder interest divided differently, doesn't want anything extra, doesn't hold the attempted maneuver against him in the way she might hold an actual successful betrayal against him. He tried something stupid because he was scared, she told me. I'm not going to pretend that's the same as him actually taking something from me. It didn't work. I get to decide how much room that leaves for forgiving him, and I've decided it leaves some. I want to give you one more piece of evidence about Neil's actual change, beyond a signed loan agreement, because I think actions matter more than the words surrounding them, and I've tried to hold my son to that same standard I'd hold anyone else to. In February, without my prompting, without any conversation between us about it at all, Neil called Lorraine and asked if he could take Ellie and Sam for a weekend so she and Mark could have an anniversary trip they'd been postponing for 2 years. It was a small thing, on its face, an uncle offering to watch his niece and nephew. But Lorraine told me afterward that it was the first time in longer than she could remember that Neil had offered to do something for her family without any larger context attached, without it being connected to money, or the house, or anything he might eventually want in return. He just did it, Dad, she told me. No agenda. Just, hey, you two should go somewhere. I've got the kids covered. I almost didn't know what to do with that from him. I think that weekend mattered more to Neil's actual rehabilitation, and my own accounting of it, than anything he said directly to me since the ultimatum. Words are cheap, and I've watched my son spend plenty of them without much behind them over these 2 years. A free weekend of genuinely inconvenient childcare, offered with nothing attached, is a different currency entirely, and I've started, slowly, to let myself believe it might mean what it appears to mean. I should give you a fuller picture of where Lorraine landed with all of this too, because I've shown you her relief and her anger in pieces, but not the fuller emotional accounting she eventually did. She came out one Sunday in the spring, just the two of us, Mark keeping the kids in Burlington that particular weekend, and we sat on the porch for the better part of an afternoon, while she worked through something out loud that I don't think she'd fully said to anyone else yet, not even Mark. I keep going back and forth, she told me, between being furious that he tried it at all and being almost grateful, in this twisted way, that it happened the way it did, instead of some other way. Because if Grandpa hadn't built it the way he built it, and Neil had actually succeeded, I don't know that we'd ever have recovered from that, Dad. Not really. Not as siblings. This way, at least, we got to find out what he was capable of without either of us actually losing anything permanent. I asked her if she'd fully forgiven him. I don't know if forgiven is the right word yet. I've decided to keep being his sister. I've decided the story isn't over, just because one really bad chapter happened. But I haven't forgotten it either, and I don't think I should have to pretend I have, just because it worked out. I told her that sounded like exactly the right amount of grace to extend, no more and no less, and she leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to as a girl, and we sat there a long while longer, not saying much else, watching the light change over the same 11 acres that had, in their own strange, legal 39-year-old way, just finished proving themselves worth protecting. Caleb asked me once, a few months after everything settled, why his dad and Aunt Lorraine hadn't been talking for a while. I told him, as honestly as I could manage for a 10-year-old, that grown-ups sometimes make decisions out of fear that hurt the people they love, and that the hardest and most important part of being a grown-up is learning to say sorry properly afterward and mean it. He thought about that for a moment and said, like when I took Molly's tablet without asking because I thought she wasn't using it. I told him it was exactly like that, just with higher stakes. And he nodded, satisfied, the way children are satisfied when an adult finally explains something in terms they can actually hold on to. There was a Thanksgiving, 8 months after the ultimatum, that I think belongs in this story more than almost anything else I could tell you about the months that followed. Because it's the closest thing to an actual resolution scene that real life has offered me, messy and incomplete in exactly the way real resolutions usually are. Everyone came. Neil and Vanessa and Caleb and Molly, Lorraine and Mark and Ellie and Sam. Gordon, who I'd started inviting to holidays since Vivian died, sitting in the same chair he'd claimed for himself every year since. It was the first time the entire family had been under one roof since before any of this started. And I want to be honest that I spent the morning genuinely uncertain whether it was a good idea at all, or whether I was simply setting myself up to watch old tensions resurface over a turkey. It wasn't smooth. Vanessa was quieter than she used to be, careful in a way that felt more like caution than genuine ease. And I understood that some trust, once broken clearly enough, simply doesn't fully return. Whatever surface politeness gets layered back over it. Neil and Lorraine spent a stretch of the afternoon in the kitchen together, just the two of them, doing dishes. And I don't know exactly what was said in there, only that Lorraine came out afterward with her eyes a little red, and Neil looking like a man who'd finally said something he'd been carrying around for the better part of a year. I want to give you the direct scene between them, rather than just that summary, because Lorraine eventually told it to me in enough detail that I think it deserves to be told properly here. Neil started drying dishes Lorraine was washing, wordlessly, the way siblings sometimes fall into an old division of labor without discussing it. Lorraine told me she let the silence sit for a while, not offering him an easy opening before Neil finally spoke. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for months, he told her, and I don't think there's a version that doesn't sound rehearsed, so I'm just going to say it badly instead. I tried to take something that was supposed to be half yours. I didn't think about you at all when I did it. Not once. I was so focused on fixing my own problem that you basically didn't exist in my head as a person who'd be affected. And I don't have a good excuse for that, Lorraine. I just have that fact, and I'm sorry for it. Lorraine told me she didn't say anything for a long moment, finishing the plate she was washing before she finally answered him. I need you to understand something, Neil. It's not really about the house. It never was for me. It's that you decided somewhere in your head that I mattered less than your problem. That's the part I'm still working through. Not the money. The math you did about whether I counted. Neil apparently didn't have an answer for that, not right away. Lorraine said he just kept drying dishes for a while, and then finally said, "You counted. You always counted." I just stopped acting like it, and I don't fully understand why, and I'm going to spend a while figuring that out, because I don't ever want to do that math again about anybody I love. That's the conversation that actually happened between them, as close as I can give it to you secondhand, and I think it matters more than a shorter summary could, because it wasn't really about forgiveness for a specific act. It was about a brother finally reckoning with the fact that he'd quietly decided, for 2 years, that his sister's claim on their shared inheritance mattered less than his own fear, and having to sit with exactly how that math had felt from the other side of it. The moment I want to actually tell you about happened later, after the meal, when Molly wandered into the front room and did what she always does, running her small hand along the edge of the granite mantle her great-great-grandfather carved decades before she was born. Caleb wandered in after her, and I heard him say, quietly, the way 10-year-olds say things they've clearly been turning over privately for a while, "This whole house is going to be ours someday, isn't it? Yours and Aunt Lorraine's kids, too." Molly asked what that meant. Caleb, with the particular confident inaccuracy of a 10-year-old repeating something he'd half understood from adult conversation, told her that great-grandpa Elias had made sure a long time ago that nobody could ever fight over the house, because he'd already decided how it would get shared before anybody alive today was even born. I stood in the kitchen doorway, unseen by either of them, and felt something in my chest settle in a way it hadn't fully settled in 2 years. Not because Caleb had the details exactly right, he didn't, not entirely, but because somewhere in that boy's 10-year-old understanding of what had happened, the actual lesson had landed anyway. Fairness, decided in advance, protected by patience rather than force. My father's whole intention, arriving intact, 3 generations later, into the mind of a child who'd never once met the man who built it. I want to give Molly a slightly fuller moment in this story, too. From a different afternoon that same spring, because I think children often understand more about a family's undercurrents than the adults around them realize. She came to me alone one afternoon while Neil and Vanessa were talking with Lorraine in the kitchen, and she climbed up onto the porch step beside me with the particular seriousness 7-year-olds bring to questions they've clearly been carrying around for a while. "Grandpa, is this house going to be mine someday?" "Part of it will be eventually. Yours and your brothers and your cousins, all shared together, a long time from now." She thought about that for a moment, swinging her feet, not quite reaching the ground. "Good. Because I want the mantle to still be here. I like touching it." "Why do you like touching it so much, sweetheart?" She considered the question with real care, the way children do when an adult actually seems to want the honest answer instead of a quick one. "Because it feels like somebody made it really carefully, like they weren't in a hurry." I sat with that for a long moment. An old man on a porch step next to a 7-year-old who had, without any idea she was doing it, described exactly what her own great-great-grandfather had built into that stone, and into the will that came decades after it, and into the whole shape of a family's protection against its own worst impulses. Not in a hurry, made carefully, by somebody willing to take considerably longer than necessary to make sure it would hold. "That's exactly right, Molly," I told her. "That's exactly what it is. I still live in the house. I still walk out to the workshop most evenings, though I've slowed down considerably on the chair I was restoring the day all of this happened. I want to tell you a little more about that chair because it became, without my particularly planning it, a kind of private symbol for the whole 2 years. It was an old ladder-back rocking chair, donated to the church's sale by an estate a few towns over, badly in need of new caning on the seat, and a fresh coat of oil on wood that had gone dry and gray from decades of neglect in somebody's attic. I'd taken on small restoration projects like it for years, mostly as a way of keeping my hands busy. And I'd started this particular chair back in early spring, well before Neil's ultimatum, expecting to finish it within a few weeks the way I usually did. I didn't touch it again for almost 8 months after that Tuesday night. It sat in the corner of my workshop, half caned, one arm still rough where I'd stopped sanding mid-stroke to answer Neil's phone call about dinner plans. A physical record of the exact moment my ordinary life had been interrupted by something considerably larger than a chair. I finally picked it back up in the spring after everything had settled, and finishing it felt like more than simply completing a project. There was something in the slow, careful work of caning that seat, weaving each strand by hand the way my father taught me 60 years ago. That felt like its own kind of repair. Not of the chair exactly, though certainly that too, but of something in myself that had gone a little rough and unfinished during those 2 pressured years. Something that needed the same patient, unhurried attention I was giving that old rocking chair. It sold at the rummage sale for $18 to a young couple furnishing their first house. And I stood at that folding table watching them carry it out to their car. And I felt something close to peace. Watching a piece of furniture I'd nursed through the hardest 2 years of my adult life head off toward an entirely new, uncomplicated life of its own. I finished it in June, finally, gave it to the sale a full year late. And nobody there seemed to mind the delay half as much as I'd worried they might. People ask me sometimes, when this story comes up, whether I feel like I won something. I've thought about that question more than almost any other one this whole ordeal produced, and I don't think winning is quite the right word for what actually happened. I didn't outsmart my son. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I didn't sit in that kitchen calculating anything clever in the moment Neil screamed at me and took my keys off the hook. I simply knew something true, that had been true for 39 years before that night ever happened. Something my own father built quietly out of love and hard-won wisdom about what money does to families who don't protect against it in advance. I didn't defeat my son. My father, dead for nearly 4 decades, protected 2 grandchildren he never lived to see grow up, from a mistake one of them hadn't even made yet. That's not revenge, not really. Whatever the title of a story like this one might promise you. Revenge implies I did something to Neil. I didn't do anything to Neil. I simply let a piece of paper written, before he was born, do what it was always going to do, regardless of anything either of us said or signed on a Tuesday night in my own kitchen. What I do feel, most days now, is something closer to a strange, complicated peace. I still love my son. I loved him in that kitchen while he was screaming at me. And I love him now, sitting across from me at a table signing a loan agreement in plain language instead of putting a folder in front of me with a thread attached. Those two things have never once, in 8 months, canceled each other out. I've had to learn to hold them both, the love and the disappointment, at the exact same time, in the exact same chest, and I won't pretend that's been easy, or that it gets meaningfully easier with time. It doesn't. You just get more practiced at carrying it. I think about my father often now, more than I did for years before this happened. I think about a man standing in a lawyer's office in 1986, quietly protecting 2 grandchildren he'd never seen fight over anything, because he'd already watched what an unprotected inheritance did to his own brother 30 years before that. I think about how much foresight it takes to build a wall around a problem that hasn't happened yet, and how much humility it takes to build that wall without ever once telling the people it protects that it's even there. The week the deed came back unrecordable, I stood alone in my own kitchen for a while, in the quiet after the phone call, and said thank you out loud to a man who died before my own children learned to walk, for a kindness he extended to them decades before either one could have possibly deserved it or understood it. I don't know what happens between Neil and me over the years I've got left. I know he asks me properly now, when he needs something, and I know that's not nothing, even if it took nearly losing everything for him to learn it. I know my daughter and I are closer than we've been since her mother died. I know the house is still standing. It still smells faintly of my father's granite dust worked into floorboards nobody has ever fully scrubbed clean. And I know that when I finally do go, whatever's left of this life will pass to both of my children equally, exactly the way a stonecutter decided it should, back before either of them had done anything at all to earn or lose that fairness. I think about the folder sometimes, still sitting somewhere in a drawer at Neil's house, I assume. A document that accomplished nothing except teaching my son the actual shape of what he'd inherited before he'd inherited it. I don't know if he's ever gone back and reread it in full, all 3 pages, the way I did that Tuesday night at my own kitchen counter. I hope he has. I think there's something instructive in rereading your own worst mistake slowly, once the panic of the moment has fully drained out of it, and seeing exactly where the seam was, exactly where a little more patience or a little more honesty would have changed everything that came after. Let me tell you what an ordinary Tuesday looks like for me now, a year and a half after that first one, because I think it says more than any single dramatic scene could about where all of this actually landed. I wake at 6, same as I always have, though I allow myself an extra 20 minutes most mornings now that I don't have 30 ninth graders waiting on me. I make coffee, read the paper, and most Tuesdays, I drive into the senior center for my 10 o'clock class, 11 students now, still teaching the same basic principles I taught for 31 years to a very different kind of audience. I have lunch with Gordon most Tuesdays too, at the diner in town, the same booth we've claimed for going on a decade. Neil calls most Sunday evenings now, a habit that's rebuilt itself slowly, call by call, over the past year and a half. The calls are different than they used to be, less about anything specific, more simply about checking in, the way a call between a father and son is supposed to work when neither party wants anything from the other beyond the conversation itself. Lorraine and the kids visit most months, sometimes with Neil's family joining them. Sometimes not, the 2 branches of this family still finding their own separate rhythm of repair. That's what these days actually look like now, rebuilt slowly, call by call and visit by visit, out of the wreckage of one very bad Tuesday, by a man who never once had to raise his voice to get there. The hook by my back door holds those same keys again now, back where they belong, and some evenings, walking past it on my way out to the workshop, I find myself simply resting my hand on it for a moment. An old man's small private ritual, a way of confirming, every single day, that the ordinary shape of his ordinary life is still exactly where he left it that morning. That's the whole of it, not a victory. Just a promise, kept 39 years after it was made, by a man who never once raised his voice to make it happen.